There is a town in Arizona named after the letter Y. There is another one named because a prospector filed his claim on December 25th and thought that was funny enough to become permanent. There is a ghost town with a tree still standing in it that 18 men were hanged from, and a town founded by a man who invented a 7-year-old frog that never learned to swim, purely to make bored travelers laugh at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. Arizona has a talent most states don't for turning genuinely small, genuinely strange decisions into place names that outlive everyone who made them. This is a countdown through 9 of them, working mining camps and half-abandoned relics, and one town that still, officially, does not have 3 letters in its name for a reason nobody actually enforces anymore. Before we start, here's a preview. You're going to see a hanging tree that's still alive today, a town that was briefly the largest ghost town in America while somehow also being fully inhabited, and a name so strange that the man who invented it built an entire comedy career out of explaining it to strangers passing through on their way to somewhere else. If half of these don't sound real by the end, that's fair, because most of Arizona feels a little bit invented once you get far enough off the interstate. Subscribe now, because we do exactly this kind of deep dive every week. And let's get into it. Picture pulling off a 2-lane highway because a road sign has a word on it that simply should not be a town name. Why? Christmas. Nothing if you caught our earlier video on that one. You assume it's a joke, a tourist trap built around a pun. Then you actually stop, and you find out the name has a real, specific, slightly absurd origin story behind it, usually involving a bureaucratic technicality, a claim filed on the wrong day, or one very determined person's sense of humor. Arizona's oddest towns aren't odd by accident. Somebody, at some point, made a very specific decision, and the desert simply never got around to correcting it. Down near the Mexican border, about 10 miles south of the old mining town of Ajo, sits a town of a little over 100 people whose entire name exists because of a highway intersection and a rule that may not have even been real. Decades ago, State Routes 85 and 86 crossed here in the shape of a Y, and locals simply started calling the spot the Y. When the community grew large enough to need an official post office, the story goes that Arizona required place names to have at least 3 letters. So instead of naming the town Y, residents spelled it out as Y. Whether that 3-letter rule ever actually existed in state law is still debated by local historians, but the story stuck hard enough that it's now permanently on the sign. The Arizona Department of Transportation eventually redesigned the intersection into a standard T-shape for safety reasons, which means the town of Y no longer contains the Y that supposedly gave it its name. Today, it survives as a single gas station and travel stop for tourists heading toward Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument or the beaches of Rocky Point across the Mexican border, a town that outlived the geometry it was named after. Up in Gila County, about 10 miles north of Winkleman, there is an old copper mining town that has been closed to the public for decades and completely uninhabited since the 1930s, but that still shows up on unusual place name lists every December. The story goes back to a boundary dispute. A pair of prospectors, Chittenden and Meller, had their eyes on a mineral claim that sat just inside the San Carlos Apache Reservation, which made it legally off-limits. When President Theodore Roosevelt signed an executive order redrawing the reservation boundary, word reportedly reached Chittenden on Christmas Eve. He and his partner rushed out that same night, found that Phelps Dodge's watchman on the disputed land had left his post to go celebrate the holiday in town and stake their claim in the early hours of December 25, 1902. They named the mine, and the town that grew up around it, Christmas, to mark the occasion. For roughly 3 decades, the town's post office became a genuine holiday tradition, taking in mail from across the entire country from people who specifically wanted a Christmas Arizona postmark on their cards. The post office finally closed in 1935 due to declining patronage, and the mine itself shut down. For good by the 1940s. Even Arizona Highways magazine once tried to get the post office reopened for a single day just to get a Christmas postmark on an issue, and was politely told no. West of Wickenburg, along Highway 60, there's a town whose entire identity was built by one man with a talent for turning nothing into a punchline. Salome was founded in 1904 by DeForest Hall, who renamed himself Dick Wick Hall after the nearby town of Wickenburg, because he needed a first name that rhymed with his new middle one. Local legend says the town itself got its name when Grace Salome Pratt, wife of Hall's business partner, tried to cross the scorching desert sand barefoot and had to dance her way across it to avoid burning her feet, giving rise to the town's official slogan, Salome, where she danced. Hall opened a gas station he called the Laughing Gas Station, plastered it with homemade joke signs poking fun at Arizona's terrible roads and brutal heat, and began publishing a newsletter called The Salome Sun, filled with tall tales about desert life. His most famous invention was a frog he claimed was 7 years old and had never learned to swim, because it had never actually seen water. The stories were popular enough to become a regular feature in the Saturday Evening Post from 1920 until Hall's death in 1926, which means a man selling gasoline in one of the most remote corners of Arizona briefly had a bigger national audience than most working journalists of his era, built entirely on jokes about a fictional dehydrated frog. 14 miles northwest of Kingman sits a town that was never actually a mining camp or a natural settlement at all, but a deliberate roadside gimmick. Santa Claus, Arizona, was founded in 1937 by Ninon Talbot and her husband after they relocated from California, built entirely around a holiday theme aimed squarely at travelers driving along the old highway. For a stretch of decades, it functioned as exactly what it sounds like, a desert stop themed around Christmas year-round, complete with candy cane architecture and a name that made for an easy, memorable postcard. Like Christmas down in Gila County, it leaned hard into holiday tourism and postmark novelty, 2 unrelated towns in the same state independently discovering that naming your community after a holiday is a surprisingly durable business model in a place where most other roadside attractions come and go within a decade. Southwest of Wickenburg stands one of the 2 best-preserved ghost towns in the entire state, built around a discovery that became Arizona's richest gold mine. In 1863, prospector Henry Wickenburg found a gold-bearing quartz outcropping that eventually produced more than 340,000 ounces of gold and 260,000 ounces of silver before the mine finally closed during World War II. At its peak, Vulture City held nearly 5,000 residents, complete with a schoolhouse, blacksmith shop, general store, saloons, and boarding houses, along with a 12-acre garden that reportedly fed 150 miners a day out in the middle of the desert. Ironically, Wickenburg himself sold his stake in the mine relatively early and spent years afterward regretting it, unsuccessfully suing the new owners for money he believed he was still owed, and eventually dying broke by his own hand around 1905. Decades before the mine he discovered would go on to produce tens of millions of dollars more. But the detail that keeps this town on every strange Arizona list is the ironwood tree still standing in front of Wickenburg's original stone cabin. Roughly 18 men accused of stealing gold ore, a practice known in mining slang as high grading, were reportedly hanged from that same tree over the course of the town's history. Victims sometimes kicked from rocks or from the backs of mules to suffer slow, deliberately public deaths meant as a warning to anyone else considering the same crime. The tree is still alive today, still growing on the exact same spot, and visitors on guided tours can walk directly underneath it. 16 miles east of Tombstone in Cochise County sits a much quieter, much less visited ghost town that never had Vulture City's fame, but carries its own specific weight. At its most prosperous, Gleeson held around 500 residents, drawn by copper, turquoise, and lead mining in the surrounding hills. What survives today is smaller and more fragmentary than Vulture City's restored complex, a scattering of adobe ruins. And one notably intact structure, the Gleeson Jail, built in 1910 to serve as a temporary holding facility for prisoners being transported to the more famous jail in Tombstone. Unlike its more famous neighbor, Gleeson never got the Hollywood treatment, never had a shootout at its own version of the OK Corral, and largely faded out of both the mining economy and the public imagination at roughly the same pace, leaving behind exactly the kind of quiet, half-forgotten ruin that draws far fewer visitors than Tombstone, but arguably tells a more honest version of how most Arizona mining towns actually ended. Down near the southern edge of the state, just 4 miles from the Mexican border, and reachable only by miles of unpaved road, sits what many historians consider the single best preserved mining ghost town in Arizona. Ruby was established in 1912, named by store owner Julius Andrews after his wife, Lily B. Ruby Andrews, and grew into the largest mining camp in southwestern Arizona at its peak in the 1930s, with a population reaching roughly 1,200 people and a schoolhouse serving 150 children. Between 1934 and 1937, the Montana mine here was the leading producer of lead and zinc in the entire state. Ruby also carries a darker reputation. Between 1920 and 1922, the town and its surroundings were the site of 3 separate double homicides, collectively known as the Ruby Murders, which triggered what's remembered as the largest manhunt in the history of the American Southwest, reportedly including the first known use of an airplane in a manhunt anywhere in the region. The mine closed in 1940, and by the end of 1941, the town was essentially abandoned. For decades afterward, Ruby remained open to the public as a walkable ghost town with around 25 surviving buildings. That changed in June of 2024, when the privately owned site closed to public access entirely, turning one of Arizona's most photographed ghost towns into one its current owners have decided nobody gets to walk through anymore. Quick pause before the final 3, because they get stranger from here. If you're the kind of person who pulls off the highway for a weird road sign, this channel exists entirely for you. Hit subscribe now, because we're about to get to the town that was briefly the largest ghost town in America, while somehow also being completely inhabited at the same time. Perched on the side of Cleopatra Hill between Prescott and Flagstaff, sits a town that earned one of the most dramatic nicknames in Arizona history, and then somehow refused to actually become a ghost town, despite everyone's best efforts. Founded in 1876 around a booming copper operation, Jerome's population exploded from a few hundred to somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people at its early 20th century peak, complete with a proliferation of saloons, brothels, and opium dens, dense enough that a New York newspaper dubbed it the wickedest town in the West in 1899, specifically noting the town had one beggarly church and at least 16 saloons, with more going up. The town endured at least 5 major fires between 1894 and 1899 alone, and in 1938, an underground mining blast actually collapsed the town's business district, sending the city jail sliding 225 feet down the mountainside it had been built on. When the mines finally closed for good in 1953, Jerome's population collapsed along with them, cratering to somewhere between 50 and 100 residents by 1960. Rather than disappearing entirely, the handful of remaining locals rebranded the town in 1967 as America's largest ghost town, technically true given how much of it stood empty, while simultaneously remaining a functioning, inhabited community the entire time, a contradiction baked directly into its own marketing. Artists and writers gradually moved in over the following decades, and today Jerome survives as a town of roughly 400 to 500 residents built almost entirely around the tourism of its own near-death experience. About 20 miles west of Prescott in Yavapai County sits the town that, more than any other on this list, makes visitors ask the obvious question before they ask anything else. Skull Valley gets its name, according to the most commonly repeated local history, from a discovery of human and animal skulls found scattered across the valley floor by early settlers, remnants most likely tied to a conflict or a natural, sometimes disaster from decades earlier, though the exact origin of the bones themselves has never been definitively settled, and multiple competing versions of the story circulate locally to this day. Unlike most of the towns on this list, Skull Valley was never purely a mining camp. It grew instead as an agricultural and ranching community, benefiting from reliable groundwater in an otherwise dry stretch of the state, which is part of why, unlike Ruby or Vulture City or Gleeson, it never fully emptied out. It's a small, quiet, still functioning rural community today, population in the low hundreds, notable mostly for the fact that everyone who hears its name assumes it must be either a joke or a horror story, when the honest answer is closer to a genuinely uncertain, still debated piece of frontier history that nobody ever got around to renaming into something friendlier for the tourists. There's something almost fitting about closing this list on the one town whose name nobody can fully explain. Every other entry on this countdown comes with a specific date, a specific person, a documented decision somebody made on purpose. Skull Valley just has bones in the dirt, and a story that's been passed down for well over a century without ever quite settling into a single, confirmed version, which might be the most honest ending a list like this could possibly have. 9 towns, 1 state, and a pattern that's hard to miss by the time you reach the end of a list like this. Arizona doesn't name its small towns the way most of the country does, after founders or geography or hopeful marketing committees. It names them after whatever specific, small, sometimes absurd thing actually happened on the day someone had to fill out the paperwork. A claim filed on a holiday. a watchman who left his post, a dancer who didn't want to burn her feet, a highway shaped like a letter, a pile of bones nobody ever fully explained. None of these towns set out to become strange footnotes. They just never got around to becoming anything else, and the name from that one specific day stuck around long after almost everything else about the place changed or disappeared entirely. That's 9, but Arizona has dozens more like this scattered across its back roads, half abandoned, oddly named, and mostly ignored by anyone driving through with somewhere else to be. It's worth remembering, too, that most of these towns weren't trying to become curiosities. Jerome wanted to be a permanent industrial city. Ruby wanted to be a stable mining community with a school and a jail and a future. Even Salome, built on jokes from the start, was still a genuine attempt to sell real estate and keep a real town alive. What actually survived, in almost every case, wasn't the ambition. It was the name, and whatever small, specific story happened to be attached to it on the day it stuck. If strange, overlooked corners of this state are your kind of thing, this channel covers a new one every week. Subscribe, and we'll keep finding them.